In the bleak final months of 1942, even the most optimistic U.S. commanders quivered at the thought of the Japanese Navy's potential for destruction. The USS Sea Lion II, a Palau-class submarine, was on her third war patrol in the Pacific.
The most lethal weapon of the Pacific War was not the atomic bomb. It was not the aircraft carrier. It was a mathematical paradox. Less than 2% of the United States Navy would go on to destroy more than half of Japan's maritime power, quietly erasing an empire by cutting its supply lines one ship at a time. But in 1942, this outcome was impossible. American submarines were plagued by broken weapons, failed doctrine, and institutional denial. To understand how Japan truly lost the war, you must first understand how the U.S. Navy nearly lost this one. Subscribe to No Man's Land for unapologetic military history, where wars are explained through steel, numbers, and consequences. Before the first American submarine ever fired a torpedo in the Pacific, the outcome of the undersea war had already been compromised by doctrine. For more than 2 decades, the United States Navy planned for a conflict defined by honor, symmetry, and decisive surface action. War was expected to culminate in a single climactic engagement where battleships would meet, trade broadsides, and determine victory through firepower and formation. In that vision, submarines were not killers, they were observers. Their role was to scout ahead of the fleet, track enemy movements, and withdraw. Commerce warfare was viewed as inefficient, morally questionable, and strategically secondary. This belief hardened into policy, and policy shaped everything that followed: training standards, command culture, and even the design of the submarines themselves. American fleet submarines were engineering marvels. They were long-ranged, fast, air-conditioned, and capable of operating thousands of miles from home port. They were built to accompany battleships, not to stalk merchant shipping. The men who commanded them were selected for caution and reliability, not aggression. This mismatch between purpose and reality went unnoticed in peacetime. Then Pearl Harbor erased the assumptions overnight. With a single order, unrestricted submarine warfare was declared against Japan. Merchant ships were now legitimate targets. The submarine was no longer a scout. It was expected to become an economic weapon capable of strangling an island empire dependent on imported oil, food, rubber, and iron. But doctrine does not change machines overnight. Weapons designed for one mission cannot instantly adapt to another. Leadership conditioned to avoid risk does not immediately embrace ruthlessness. The United States had assigned its submarine force a mission it was never designed to execute. As 1942 began, American submarines sailed into enemy waters carrying the burden of impossible expectations. They were ordered to destroy Japan's lifeline without the doctrine, culture, or equipment required to do it. The collapse of the Japanese Empire would eventually begin here. But first, the American system itself had to fail. The moment Pearl Harbor was attacked, American naval doctrine ceased to exist in any meaningful form. The carefully written rules of engagement, built for a theoretical war of battleships and honor, collapsed in a single morning. On December 7, 1941, the United States Navy issued an order that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier: unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan. With one sentence, the submarine was transformed. No longer a scout, no longer an auxiliary, it was now authorized to hunt anything that floated. Japan was uniquely exposed to this decision. Unlike continental powers, it was an island empire with almost no natural resources. Nearly all of its oil, iron, rubber, and much of its food had to cross thousands of miles of ocean aboard merchant ships. These vessels were not luxuries. They were arteries. Without them, factories stopped, aircraft stayed grounded, and fleets became immobile steel shells. American planners understood this vulnerability in theory. In practice, they were unprepared to exploit it. The submarines sent out in early 1942 carried weapons that belonged to a different war. Crews trained to observe were suddenly expected to execute. Commanders conditioned to conserve fuel and avoid detection were now ordered to take risks, close distance, and destroy targets relentlessly. The cultural shift was immediate on paper, but slow at sea. Worse still, the weapon meant to carry out this new mission was catastrophically flawed. The Mark 14 torpedo was supposed to be the sharp edge of American undersea warfare. Instead, it was a liability. Attacks that should have resulted in sinking ships produced nothing but silence. Torpedoes passed beneath targets. They detonated early. They struck hulls and failed to explode. For the first time, Japanese escorts began to notice something deeply unsettling. American submarines were present. They were firing, but ships were not sinking. The submarine war had officially begun, and it was already failing. At the center of the submarine, war's early failure was a weapon that existed more as theory than reality. The Mark 14 steam torpedo was supposed to be a masterpiece. It carried a massive warhead, had exceptional range, and incorporated a revolutionary magnetic exploder designed to detonate beneath a ship's keel. On paper, it was devastating. In combat, it was disastrous. Submarine captains began reporting a pattern almost immediately. Perfect attack setups produced nothing. Torpedoes ran under targets without detonating. Others exploded prematurely, hundreds of yards short of the ship. Some struck the hull with an audible clang and simply sank to the bottom. By mid-1942, American submarines had fired hundreds of torpedoes with negligible results. The return on effort was so poor that Japanese escorts began to draw conclusions of their own. They noticed that attacks rarely resulted in damage. Some destroyers stopped maneuvering aggressively. Merchant captains maintained course after spotting torpedo wakes. The enemy had realized something unthinkable. The Americans were firing duds. Back in the United States, the Bureau of Ordnance refused to accept responsibility. Reports from the field were dismissed as exaggerations or blamed on poor crew performance. Experienced skippers were told their firing solutions were incorrect. The torpedo, the Bureau insisted, had been thoroughly tested. That claim was false. In reality, the Mark 14 had never been tested under real combat conditions. No live warhead had ever been fired against an actual ship hull. The testing data the Bureau relied on dated back more than a decade and was built on assumptions rather than evidence. Cost, secrecy, and institutional pride had replaced verification. This created a fatal feedback loop. Crews knew their weapons were unreliable, but they were ordered to trust them anyway. Each failed attack reinforced hesitation. Aggression gave way to doubt. Doubt reduced effectiveness even further. By the end of 1942, the American submarine force was not strangling Japanese supply lines. It was exposing its own systemic weaknesses. The problem was no longer just mechanical. It was institutional. A navy that could not admit failure could not correct it. And until that changed, the Pacific would remain open to Japan's lifelines. The breaking point did not come from Washington. It came from the edge of the empire. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood arrived in the Pacific with no patience for theory and no tolerance for excuses. He was not interested in protecting reputations. He was interested in results. And the results told a story that could no longer be ignored. Lockwood reviewed patrol logs from veteran submarine commanders and saw something impossible to dismiss. Experienced crews were missing stationary targets at ideal ranges. These were not amateurs. These were officers who had trained for years. The failures were too consistent to be coincidence. Something was fundamentally wrong. The most common complaint was depth. Torpedoes set to run at 10 feet were passing harmlessly beneath ships, drawing far less water. Lockwood did what the Bureau of Ordnance had refused to do for years. He tested it. In mid-1942, at a remote anchorage in Australia, Lockwood improvised a controlled experiment. A fishing net was suspended underwater. A Mark 14 torpedo was fired straight through it. The setting was 10 feet. The hole appeared more than 20 feet below the surface. The torpedo was running over 10 feet deeper than indicated. This was not operator error. It was a systematic design flaw. Lockwood sent the data to Washington. The response was denial. The Bureau blamed ocean conditions, calibration error, even the net itself. Anything except the torpedo. The implication was clear. The data from the field was inconvenient. Admitting failure would expose years of negligence. Lockwood ignored them. He ordered unauthorized modifications. Pressure sensors were adjusted. Manuals were quietly bypassed. Mechanics in forward bases became engineers. For the first time, the submarine force began trusting evidence over authority. This was more than a technical fix. It was a cultural rupture. The rigid, hierarchical Navy of the pre-war years was giving way to something more dangerous and more effective. A force willing to challenge doctrine, question leadership, and adapt under fire. The torpedo was still broken. The magnetic exploder was still unreliable. But the illusion of perfection had been shattered. And once an institution loses its illusion, it has only two options left: correct itself or collapse. By mid-1943, denial was no longer sustainable. The depth-setting flaw had been exposed, yet sinkings remained far below what mathematics demanded. Submarine commanders were now hitting targets and watching them survive. The torpedo had evolved from unreliable to openly deceptive. The breaking moment came in July 1943. The USS Tenosa intercepted one of the most valuable targets in the Pacific, a massive Japanese oil tanker. Its destruction should have been inevitable. The tanker was slow, exposed, and perfectly positioned. Lieutenant Commander Dan Daspit executed the attack exactly as doctrine prescribed. His torpedoes struck the hull. The ship shuddered, and nothing happened. Daspit maneuvered closer, 800 yards, a perfect 90-degree firing angle. Another torpedo slammed into the tanker. A dull metallic clang echoed through the periscope view. No explosion. Again and again, Daspit fired. 9 torpedoes hit. 9 torpedoes failed. The tanker survived. Daspit did something extraordinary. He saved his final torpedo and returned to Pearl Harbor with it intact. Rear Admiral Lockwood personally oversaw its inspection. What they discovered ended the debate forever. The contact exploder was fundamentally flawed. On a perfect hit, the deceleration forces were so violent that the firing pin jammed before it could strike the detonator. The torpedo failed precisely because it was accurate. Bad shots worked. Good shots didn't. Lockwood was finished asking permission. He ordered the magnetic exploders deactivated across the Pacific Fleet. He authorized field modifications to the firing pins, shaving off metal to reduce friction. These were unauthorized changes made in wartime workshops, not approved laboratories. Within weeks, sinkings increased. By September 1943, nearly 2 years into the war, the United States Navy finally possessed a torpedo that behaved like a weapon instead of a liability. The scandal was over. The excuse phase had ended. Now the submarine force faced a different question. What happens when a broken system suddenly works? The answer would not be gradual. It would be catastrophic. Fixing the torpedo solved only half the problem. The other half was human. The pre-war submarine force had been shaped by caution. Commanders were trained to avoid risk, conserve fuel, and bring their boats home intact. In peacetime, this mindset was professionalism. In total war, it was lethal. Rear Admiral Lockwood understood this immediately. A working weapon in the hands of hesitant commanders would still fail to produce results. The submarine war was not a defensive exercise, it was economic assassination, and it required men willing to act like it. In 1943, Lockwood initiated one of the most ruthless leadership purges in U.S. naval history. Nearly 30% of submarine skippers were removed from command. These were not cowards. Many were competent officers by peacetime standards, but competence was no longer enough. Lockwood wanted aggression, initiative, and a willingness to close distance under fire. He replaced them with younger officers, many still in their 20s, men who had not been shaped by decades of rigid doctrine. These commanders did not see the submarine as a fragile reconnaissance platform. They saw it as a predator. They were encouraged to attack aggressively, maneuver boldly, and exploit every opportunity without waiting for permission. The culture shifted almost overnight. Patrol reports changed tone. Attacks were closer. Engagements were repeated. Boats stayed on station longer and pressed their luck harder. Risk tolerance increased because results finally justified it. The archetype of this new mindset was Dudley "Mush" Morton of the USS Wahoo. Morton rejected passive engagement entirely. He fired down-the-throat shots at charging destroyers and attacked convoys in daylight. Tactics that would have been considered suicidal in 1941 were now rewarded. Lockwood didn't micromanage these men. He trusted them. That trust was radical. It decentralized decision-making and compressed the kill chain. Submarine commanders were no longer awaiting approval. They were executing intent. By late 1943, the American submarine force had undergone a complete transformation. The weapons worked. The commanders hunted. The institution that once resisted change had been forcibly reshaped. What followed was not a learning curve. It was an avalanche. The Pacific Ocean covered more than 60 million square miles. By any traditional logic, hunting ships across that space should have been impossible. Random patrols, blind searching, chance encounters. That was how navies had always approached the problem. The American submarine force stopped thinking that way. Instead of searching, they began intercepting. In Hawaii, inside a windowless bunker known as Station Hypo, cryptanalysts had broken large portions of Japan's naval and merchant shipping codes. The most important breakthrough was not a battle plan, but a bureaucracy. Japanese convoy movements were scheduled, logged, and transmitted with clockwork regularity. Positions were reported daily. Routes were standardized. Timing mattered more than concealment. To Japanese administrators, this was efficiency. To American submariners, it was a timetable. Lockwood's operations staff stopped assigning vague patrol zones. They issued precise intercept orders. Be here, at this time. Expect these ships. The Pacific was no longer an ocean. It was a grid, and Japanese merchant vessels were moving targets trapped inside it. The results were immediate and violent. In 1942, American submarines sank roughly 180,000 tons of shipping. In 1943, That number exploded to more than 1.5 million tons. Japan entered the war with approximately 6 million tons of merchant capacity. It needed half of that just to keep civilians fed and factories operating. The rest sustained the military. By the end of 1943, the surplus was gone. The Imperial Navy still dreamed of a decisive fleet battle, but its economy was already bleeding out. Oil shipments from the Dutch East Indies vanished. Raw materials piled up uselessly in southern ports, while factories in Japan slowed or shut down entirely. Escort doctrine failed to adapt. Destroyers were hoarded for fleet actions rather than convoy protection. Anti-submarine warfare was treated as a secondary duty, unworthy of elite officers. The vastness of the Pacific was assumed to be protection enough. It wasn't. To the Americans, distance no longer mattered. Information collapsed it. Every intercepted convoy wasn't a lucky find. It was a scheduled execution. By the time Japanese commanders realized the pattern, the math had turned against them. The merchant fleet was shrinking faster than it could be replaced. The submarine force was no longer correcting past failures. It was compounding success. And the collapse had only begun. By 1944, the submarine war crossed a threshold. This was no longer disruption. It was strangulation. The mathematics of shipping turned exponential, and Japan no longer had the margin to absorb losses. Every sunk freighter removed capacity that could not be replaced. Shipyards lacked steel. Crews lacked fuel. Time ran out. The most lethal battlefield was not Midway or Saipan. It was the narrow water between Taiwan and the Philippines, the Luzon Strait. Every tanker carrying oil from the southern resource zone had to pass through this funnel. Lockwood turned it into a kill box. Submarines waited with patience, guided by intelligence and radar, striking convoys that could not reroute or hide. In 1944 alone, Japan lost nearly 4 million tons of merchant shipping. That figure exceeded the entire merchant fleet of some European nations. Oil tankers vanished first. Without fuel, pilot training collapsed. Aircraft sat idle. Warships burned crude oil directly in their boilers, destroying engines from the inside just to move between ports. Raw materials followed. Bauxite imports fell by more than 90%. Aluminum production collapsed. Aircraft were built with recycled, brittle metal that failed under stress. Food shipments declined as military cargo was prioritized. Civilian caloric intake dropped sharply. A nation that could not feed its workforce could not sustain industry. The Imperial Navy attempted desperate countermeasures: high-speed convoys, escort carriers, reinforced routes. It changed nothing. Wolfpack tactics allowed submarines to coordinate attacks autonomously. Radar erased darkness. Convoys were detected long before escorts understood they were threatened. Some sinkings were so complete that records stopped being kept. Ships departed southern ports and never arrived. No distress calls, no survivors, just blank entries in shipping ledgers. This collapse reshaped major battles. Japanese pilots entered combat with minimal training because fuel no longer existed to train them. At the Philippine Sea, they were slaughtered. At Leyte Gulf, submarines crippled the Japanese fleet before surface combat even began. By the end of 1944, Japan still possessed territory, but it no longer possessed an economy. The empire was intact on maps. It was already dead in reality. By 1945, the Pacific War continued only in appearance. On paper, Japan still possessed a navy, factories, and territory. In reality, the mechanisms that allowed a modern state to function had already failed. The American submarine blockade had done its work. There was nothing left to strangle. Patrol reports from early 1945 reveal a surreal problem: target scarcity. Submarines designed to hunt capital ships now found empty seas. Days passed without contact. When targets did appear, they were often small wooden craft carrying rice or refugees. The once crowded shipping lanes of the Pacific had become silent. To finish the process, the strategy shifted from interception to paralysis. Operation Starvation sealed Japan's coastal waters with thousands of mines. Ports shut down, harbors emptied, coastal traffic collapsed almost overnight. Even ships that survived the submarines could not move. Inside Japan, the effects were biological. Average caloric intake dropped below survival thresholds. Factories went idle for lack of raw materials. Trains stopped running because there was no fuel. Warships sat immobile in port, camouflaged with trees, reduced to floating anti-aircraft platforms. The Navy that once ruled the Pacific could no longer leave harbor. The submarines adapted again. With no ships left to sink, they became rescuers. American boats surfaced near the Japanese coast in daylight to recover downed air crews. It was a complete inversion of power. Japan watched from shore as enemy submarines operated with impunity in its home waters. When atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they struck cities that were already economically dead. The surrender aboard the USS Missouri was a political act. The strategic verdict had been delivered months earlier, silently, by submarines. Japan did not lose because it lacked courage or engineering skill. It lost because it misunderstood modern war. It prepared for a duel of fleets. It faced an audit of logistics. The Imperial Navy built symbols of power and neglected the infrastructure that sustained them. The American system began the war broken. Its weapons failed. Its doctrine was wrong. But it retained something decisive: the ability to admit failure and adapt. Leaders like Lockwood were allowed to challenge institutions. Data was allowed to overrule pride. The lesson of the Pacific Submarine War is simple and brutal. Wars are not won by spectacle. They are won by sustainment, by numbers, by who controls the flow of fuel, food, and steel. Japan fought for honor. America fought the math, and math does not negotiate.